He's really he's shameless in intellectual argument. He's absolutely without character, a moral foundation, or even intellectual substance.
Welcome back to the Getting Lit podcast. Last episode, we talked about John Crowley's Little Big, the first section, and the first volume of our series that we'll be doing every month. So if you haven't got Little Big, maybe go out and purchase that or borrow that from the library and read along with me and John in that series. This episode, I'm doing something slightly different. It's a solo episode, and I just wanted to sort of jump off on something that I noticed online recently. I have been trying to avoid online discourse and things like that. Obviously, if you've listened to this show for a while, you know that I'm kind of going for something a little bit more timeless, I guess, by not focusing on so-called current thingism and online discourse. But I saw something recently. It was a few weeks ago, and it's a sort of perennial topic that comes up again and again and again, and it involves the film adaptation of Robert Heinlein's Starship Troopers, directed by Paul Verhoeven. Now, a lot of stuff on Twitter, FKA Twitter, sorry, now known as X, was going around talking about how people of a right-wing persuasion are misunderstanding certain things in Starship Troopers. I can't even remember what the original tweet was, but basically someone was saying something along the lines of the bugs in Starship Troopers, which are the aliens, if you haven't seen the movie. I'm assuming most people have seen the movie, so I'll just, I won't give you a plot summary, but basically someone was saying that the bugs were not malevolent, essentially, that they were provoked into a war with the humans. And then this whole like drama began, like back and forth with people of a sort of more right-wing persuasion and a more left-wing persuasion about what the movie actually means and what was intended in the movie. And so people made a lot of hay, obviously, about from the progressive side of things that, you know, Starship Troopers is a parody of like fascist societies, right? Like it does, Paul Verhoeven very clearly does that in the way that he depicts the media. The media in the world of the movie is very kind of fascistly coded. Same with the fashion, all that sort of stuff. But the kind of key point that was I'm bored even talking about it, but the key point around it was this idea of like the aggression of the bugs being like, kind of, was that provoked by human expansionism, or was that just something that occurred? So there was all this debate about like a fake sort of story, which I found quite funny. But one of the things that I also found interesting about it was that people, especially kind of the more left-wing critiques of it, were falling back on this idea of Verhoeven's intention, because Verhoeven's like said in interviews about the film is that he started reading the book, didn't finish it, and then decided that the film was going to be a parody of the book, because he sort of, I don't know if he ever sort of explicitly said this, but basically was like, you know, Heinlein is, it's the book has sort of got fascist sympathies, which, by the way, I'll be covering that book fairly soon in the next couple of months. So, and it really doesn't, for the record, but Anyway, that's what Verhoeven went with. He decided to do a sort of parody of what he saw in the film as this militaristic society. But what was interesting about this is that I watched it. I didn't really partake in these debates. I never do. Like, if I want to debate, I don't really debate anything. But if I want to talk about ideas, as you might say, I do that. That's what the podcast is for, right? So yeah, a lot of them were the critiques were sort of falling back on this idea of Verhoeven as the author being this kind of node of authority, that the meaning of the film redounds to whatever the author intended. Now, this is very interesting to me because this is what these people were claiming. These are the same kind of people, but they also use that kind of um, very annoying term, media literacy, which basically just means my interpretation is right when it comes to viewing media. Um, but it's interesting because those same people kind of believe in the death of the author in other contexts, right? So, and the death of the author is a sort of concept that I'll explain in a second. But basically, to sort of put it in really condensed terms, it means that the interpretation of any kind of work, be it a movie, a film, a book, a painting, anything like that, it's all open up. It's up for interpretation. Like what the author intended, isn't really relevant to the way that you experience something and what you get out of it individually and like as an audience, right? And this is a very like a kind of key sort of I guess it's almost a shibboleth really that with particularly progressive people and the way that they look at media and art is that it's all open to different forms of interpretations and readings. But then we were seeing the opposite thing online when we were seeing people basically justifying their particular reading of this film and where it sat politically and what did it mean within the world of the film by going back to this idea of the author, and the author suddenly has legitimacy. And so I wanted to sort of talk about that today in this episode by just going through what the death of the author is and how we're in a weird situation where this is happening a lot, actually, wherever there are these sorts of arguments online over how to interpret a text or media literacy or these buzzwords, which if you're not online, you probably haven't really seen very much, but they're out there, right? And the way I'd like to kind of get into this is basically to go through some work I've done before online with regard to this idea of authorship and what what is meant by the idea of the death of the author and what we lose when we kind of lose this concept of the author and in terms of how we interpret things, but how this is working in all of this sort of discourse and culture war stuff around, media. So yeah, what I think is very interesting about it is like in this very instance that I'm describing with the Starship Troopers debate, which, by the way, this rears its ugly head every fucking 6 months. Like people are always debating Starship Troopers for some reason. And it's always like interpretive debates, like, oh, it actually means this. But in this case, I thought it was interesting that people were falling back on the legitimacy of the author when at other times they don't believe the author is legitimate in any way as a way to center your interpretation of a text. So, yeah, what I'm going to do is sort of go through the idea of the author, the death of the author, which was introduced sort of by the French philosopher Roland Barthes, who I've talked about before. And then I'll just sort of go through some examples of why I think the author kind of still does matter, but why I think what Barthes has to say, like very, back in the 60s, is still relevant to today, but the way that what he has to say has been used and abused, particularly online, because I really think that people don't really understand this concept and they're constantly misusing it. You might say they're media illiterate when it comes to the death of the author concept. So one of the things I would say would be that even if you're not a creative writer, if you're on social media of any sort, um, you are an author of a kind. So I would say that we're all authors now. Most of us don't write books, but like we post, we quote unquote create on TikTok or YouTube. We tweet far too much, perhaps about Starship Troopers. We post on Reddit. There's lots of authorship going on if you count like posts and things like that as authorship, which I think you should, because authorship is everywhere, but the concept itself doesn't necessarily center our digital experience. For example, like when you're enjoying a meme, you don't really need to know who first created it to appreciate it. And memes rarely have authors, you know. Some people try to watermark them and stuff like that to identify the author, but we don't need that to appreciate it. So with that in mind, this sort of like generative, like even with the AI stuff, like emerging online, there's lots of, or some would say lots of creativity and generation of culture online, exploding online. Have we sort of finally succeeded in killing off the authority of the author? No, as we have seen from this example that I was giving before, with people sort of falling back on this idea when it's useful. So Roland Barthes, who I mentioned before, and I've mentioned him in a couple of other episodes, he's one of those pesky French post-structuralists. But unlike a lot of those, he's not really an obscurantist. I think he happens to be quite readable, and his work often looks to untangle symbols that tend to affect society and culture, right? So one of the reasons he's helpful is his style. And it's really great style to read because it's sort of like friendly, but it's also catty, because he is a gay man. And it's sometimes pithy, and he's often quite hilarious. People don't appreciate how funny this guy is. So he might also hate this reverence for his authorial qualities, since one of his most famous work is the death of the author. So this concept, which I mentioned before, that I'll go into, he wrote about this in 1967, and it's a very short essay. You can probably find a PDF of it. And basically, he contends that the author of a text shouldn't be the guiding force of a text's interpretation. Right? So we don't need to fall back on the author themselves as to get anything out of a text or a book or whatever. Because it's not, he would say that it's not necessary, but there is a particular style that he was talking about in terms of interpreting something that comes from an idea of a biographical idea of an author that kind of goes into the way that we're supposed to read books. So yeah, Barth he sort of disputed the common way in which critics and professional interpreters of books and stuff at in his time they tended to fall back on biography and other details about authors in to sort of construct definitive meanings of things. So one of the famous passages where he explains this is sort of early on, and I'll just quote it. Quote, the explanation of a work is always sought in the man or woman who produced it, as if it were always in the end, through the more or less transparent allegory of the fiction, the voice of a single person, the author confiding in us. So this kind of explanation, Barthes thought was a limited way of reading. And I think to an extent he was right. We don't really need biographical information of people, of the some of the greatest works of literature. So no one really knows who wrote Beowulf, for example, or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. The authors of these texts, their identities weren't really recorded. Though, you know, historians and scholars and people like that have tried to sort of build an idea of them to sort of identify what kind of person they are. And the reason this is, like Beowulf and Sir Gawain and Green Knight are obviously sort of a medieval texts. But, you know, in medieval times, the notion of the capital A author was not as important in the Middle Ages as it became in the modern era. So this idea of the death of the author, remember the author not being the guiding light of the way that we kind of read a text. This concept was quite important to what was known as the postmodern turn in literary and cultural studies in the 70s. So consequently, it's kind of something of a given in the cultural sector, especially for those who, you know, critique or talk about books or films. But curiously, like I said, many people seem to resurrect the author when convenient. Um, and like the Starship Trooper kind of hot takes, um, we will often see reviews that do this, where the reviewer spends an inordinate amount of time reading something into a story the author probably didn't intend. And then at other times we'll have these same reviewers or shit posters or whatever identify a specific authorial style or the impact that the author's biography has on their art. That biographical stuff is often talked about with authors who are from minorities, for instance. So people don't believe in the depth of the author in those sorts of cases. So there's been a couple of recent examples where, you know, questions of authenticity in fiction, and like I said, especially fiction involving minorities, kind of collide with this like postmodern adoption of the death of the author concept. I remember one during just before the pandemic, I think it was, there was an example of this called American Dirt. So this was, I think it was 2020. The book concerns a Mexican woman fleeing the drug cartels into the US. And because the book was written by a white woman by the name of Janine Cummings, who apparently did not represent Mexican culture authentically enough, it kind of caused an outrage. I actually remember ridiculous back and forths online. Again, the premise of this episode is ridiculous back and forths online, but I remember this one specifically, where someone was complaining about this book because Cummings wrote a scene at a Mexican cookout and there was barbecue sauce there. And apparently this was completely unrealistic because Mexicans apparently, according to this person, don't like barbecue sauce. So, people brought up this as like the ultimate kind of example of unpersuasive, inauthentic kind of writing. And they link this back to the author's identity slash biography, right? So no death of the author here. The author is very much alive because she's not doing it properly, apparently. So, as what usually happens with situations like this, some writers complained a white woman had appropriated a story that was not hers to tell, and occupied a slot in a publishing industry that apparently doesn't champion enough minority writers. Okay, so I would say this claim is arguable. Is anyone except minorities published these days? But you know, get back to me on that. Actually, don't. I don't want to hear it. But what I think this shows, this and sort of some other examples that have come up, is that authorship is used and reified in one context, and then it's just completely dismissed in another. So it's very convenient the way that people use authorship. And also, it's very convenient and used by the very same people often. So authenticity then becomes linked to author biography, and which suggests that the author is not dead at all, that who the author is really matters. Were he still alive, I think Barthes would really have none of this. For him, the author is always preceded by their own language, its idioms, its cliches, its conventions. They're not independently creating their text. Their text is responding to, referencing, building on, or arguing with other texts. Okay. So while this kind of view became sort of typical to deconstructionists like Jacques Derrida and Paul de Man, uh, there is a similar idea of authorship which predates them in the new criticism of the early 20th century. And both of these kind of theoretical sort of schools of thought kind of dovetail in a lot of these debates in the late 20th century around authorship. So in the new criticism, there was a couple of guys called William Wimsatt and Munro Beardsley. They created this idea, which you might have heard before, called the intentional fallacy, which this insists that the author's intention is irrelevant to the meaning of a piece of literature. What's on the page is all that matters, according to them. The only time an author's biography or historical period was relevant to a text's meaning is if it's mentioned in the text. So they were very hard line on this. The new critics stressed close reading of mostly poems to draw out what made them work on a sort of line to line, word to word, stanza to stanza basis. But it should be said that this is quite different to what Barthes and his followers have argued. So Wimsatt and Beardsley aim to understand the nuts and bolts of literature, whereas Barthes' aims were more political to suggest, what the study of literature ought to be. So another famous quoted line from Barthes' essay is, "The birth of the reader must be at the cost of the death of the author." So this idea has been really influential in literature and cultural studies, and even creative writing classes sort of go into some of this. And this leads to a proliferation of various quote unquote readings of books, of theater, of films, of television, even readings of whole subcultures and their codes and conventions. A common theme running through like things like queer or feminist or Marxist quote unquote readings of popular culture texts is that the creator's intentions don't matter so much as sort of powerful social forces or unconscious behaviors or the conventions and ideologies of previous sort of pop cultural texts acting forcefully on creators. So it's an interesting way of looking at it because it kind of disempowers the author in a way. The author of a book has little agentic effect on their own creation. They're merely a step in a long chain of myth making. This is also known as symptomatic reading, and it's sort of less to do with excising the author in order to reveal the technical effects, as it was with New Critics that I was talking about before, and more to do with uncovering the various ways in which other forces are realized in the text. So these ways of looking at cultural product just swap out the author for something else and make the interpretation of a book, of a film, of any sort of piece of art no less limited because they're limiting it with something else other than the author. So they remove the author and then just limit it with some, something about like a queer reading or a Marxist reading, something like that. So it's kind of hypocritical. But perhaps the kind of biggest problem with the way that the death of the author stuff has passed down to us, and is very emblematic in the situation that I was talking about before online with the way that people talk about art these days, is that the way that it's been popularized is that artworks just mean whatever you want them to mean, and that there's like intentionless meaning. And so there's an assumption, the assumption is both nonsensical, and it kind of does have sort of ethical issues if you care about that sort of stuff. So Barthes refers to authors throughout his essay as scriptors. So he essentially demotes writers like Balzac, Valéry, Mallarmé, to mere stenographers for the literary styles and codes of 19th century France. So he says, quote, "It is language which speaks, not the author." Like I said before, the deconstructionists like Derrida, they championed this idea of intention. Uh, for these people, like there is nothing outside the text. It's a common kind of catchphrase or slogan that they have, which means that the way we interpret texts is always through other texts. So, you'll the way you read a book is from all of the books that you've already read, and the way that a book is written is through all the books that an author has already read. So language especially is a matter of meaningless or empty structure that, social convention and, repetition fills with meanings that seem natural. There are also other meanings, right, so that are hidden or papered over or overlooked due to the way that, conventions sort of shape and change the apprehension of meaning over time, so that even the author can be unaware of what they were saying, and could have a variety of contradictory meanings. So this works against the idea of intention, like the author's intention, by claiming that meaning is something that's largely out of the author's control because language shapes the author rather than the author shaping language, if that makes sense. It's sort of like a reversal of what, we think happens when an author writes. So this was very common in the postmodernism, the postmodern theory, all that sort of stuff. This view of language as something that is just that shapes people rather than shaped by people, right? Something about this is kind of like it's a little bit daffy though, because this view of language and meaning would have us believe that communicating is almost accidental, that we can't ever mean what we say, and that we're all subject to the language that we're raised in. Not only does an idea of intentionless meaning, that is to say, like a meaning that is not intended by an author, not only is that far-fetched and kind of deterministic, It's also incoherent. Meaning simply cannot exist without intention. Like it doesn't make sense to say that intentionless meaning is it's a tautology or it's redundant or whatever that word is that means it just cancels each other out. Both of the words in that phrase. This is something that some a guy called Walter Ben Michaels and a companion Stephen Knapp argued back in the 80s when they were really like pissed off with all of this bullshit theory about trying to say that an author can't ever mean what they say, that like language speaks through authors rather than the other way around and so forth. So while, quote unquote theory marched on, I think they they kind of introduced an illustrative example that kind of lays bare how incoherent a lot of this stuff is. Unfortunately, a lot of this incoherence sort of filtered through the universities, and a lot of people think like this now. And they think that sort of meaning is just completely untethered from intention, which doesn't make sense. Like it really doesn't. Um, so they had this really good sort of model for explaining why this is an impossibility, right? The idea of intentionless meaning. So they sort of introduce this idea of you're on a beach, we're walking along the beach, and we come across some lines in the sand. Okay. We quickly realize that they're not just lines, they're not just squiggles, but they are words arranged into the first stanza of a William Wordsworth poem. Okay, you see that? Oh, yeah, it's a poem, right? Someone's written a poem on the beach. Then a wave comes in and sweeps away the stanza, but replaces it with another piece of poetry. At that moment, we would realize something weird has happened because obviously that's physically impossible. You don't see that often. Um, when you witness the first stanza, though, we assumed an author, even if we didn't know who it was. Maybe someone had written the poem in the stand with sick. But when the second stanza comes in, once the wave crashes over the first and then the wave recedes and we get that second stanza, that confuses things. We're suddenly left to wonder who or what is writing this. Is it the ghost of some romantic beachcomber? Is it Poseidon, the Greek god of the sea, commanding the waves to express his poetic side? Or is the phenomenon just an enormous coincidence, right? Like a really 1 in a billion chance of random sort of rivulets or whatever formed in the sand that happened to spell out the stanza of a poem. If the poem was written by some supernatural, mysterious force, it's still an intentional agent expressing itself through language. If it was a coincidence, there is no intention, and thus the lines in the sand aren't language, they merely resemble language. So what that would be, if it was a coincidence, it would be a case of what's known as pareidolia. So this is the phenomenon of, seeing shapes in faces in clouds or, faces on the surface of Mars. Although I think there is a face on the surface of Mars. I choose to believe that. But that's usually the explanation, right? Pareidolia. It's a kind of mental phenomenon that humans have. So the people who sort of claim that intentionless meaning exists, they say that the meaning is out of the author's hands, that the idea of intention is a way of asserting the author's control over the meaning of a text. But a text can't exist without intention because a text is an intentional object, meaning someone intends to create it. This is very basic stuff. Language is, among other things, an expression of intention. If writing is all just a coincidence of squiggles, then it's no longer language. So while erasing, authorial intent is nonsensical, and that's something that's come down to us through this idea of the death of the author, Some people have sort of pointed out that there's an ethical dimension to this as well, um, which, these postmodern types and deconstructionists and theory heads have too rarely kind of reckoned with. The main one being, if an author is irrelevant to as a locus of meaning, then an author's responsibility for what they write is in question. So there's a really good example of this too from an actual deconstructionist. So Paul de Man, who was one of the most well-known of the deconstructionists, probably after Derrida, he's an interesting example of this. In 1987, 4 years after he died, it was revealed that he wrote for Le Soir, which was a Nazi newspaper in Belgium, like a collaborator newspaper. So from 1941 to 42, he wrote at least 100 articles for this publication, and many of them expressed anti-Semitic and pro-Nazi sentiments. So, to be fair to Demand, there is some doubt as to whether he truly believed what he was writing. So after his work for Le Soir came to light, he had Jewish colleagues who sort of insisted he wasn't anti-Semitic at all. And, he was just keeping his head down and working. That was sort of the justification for it. He could have been young and impressionable, his friends said, or he could have just been towing the line to sort of, ensure his safety. I'm sure a lot of people did that. So some opponents of postmodernism, your Jordan Petersons and people like that might sort of use this as an example to show you how, postmodern theorists' harmful relativism in like the theory invites that sort of relativism, right? So along with people like Barthes, who I mentioned before, and Derrida, de Man argued that there's no stable subject in writing, that biography and intention have no bearing on interpretation. Again, that slogan, there is no outside text. So there's nothing outside the text. So even the author doesn't exist. It's only like texts that inform other texts. But if this is the case, de Man isn't culpable for the Nazi propaganda he espoused. If the author is just a cog in the textual machine, then de Man cannot be sort of condemned for consciously writing for a collaborationist newspaper. In other words, a cog can't be guilty because a cog has no agency. So at best, this sort of removal, this theory which removes the idea of authorial intent is, ethically ambiguous. But at worst, it could be considered, immoral. One must be responsible for what they write, as you might say, but they can only be responsible for what they write if they intended it. Writing is, after all, no accident, which is again getting back to this point that intentionless meaning doesn't make any sense.
Millions of books written on every conceivable subject by all these great minds, and in the end, none of them knows anything more about the big questions of life than I do. Jeez, I read Socrates, this guy used to knock off little Greek boys. What the hell's he got to teach me? And Nietzsche with his theory of eternal recurrence. He said that the life we live, we're going to live over and over again the exact same way for eternity. Great. That means I'll have to sit through the ice capades again. It's not worth it. And Freud, another great pessimist. Jeez, I was in analysis for years. Nothing happened. My poor analyst got so frustrated. The guy finally put in a salad bar.
So one of the reasons I think this is relevant to what I was talking about at the top of the episode was that these nonsensical and incoherent ideas about authorship are not mere distractions. They're often useful tools in the culture wars. Discourse, current thingism, whatever you want, media literacy, whatever you want to, whatever label we want to put on it. Because at any moment, an author's intention can be invoked or revoked to praise or condemn. This tendency isn't limited to literary or cultural criticism. Um, One of the things, I've seen over the years of being online is this tired and rote online activist idea of impact versus intent. So someone might say something not intending to be insulting, racist, or sexist, but it could be received that way. The impact of the author of the words matters more than the intent. However, like what's interesting about this is that other times where intent is considered clear and someone says or writes something unashamedly insulting, racist, or sexist, the impact is considered equivalent, which just begs the question, which which is it? Like, which principle is operating here? Does intention matter or not? If it doesn't matter, if the author is merely a cipher through which language or discourses or ideologies speak, the author can't be completely responsible for what they say. But if intention does matter, then the author can be held accountable, which people always seem to want to do with authors. So like a lot of things with like heavily like theoretical stuff that fucking comes out of the universities and poisons culture with its relativism or more the relativism and the way it's used, I think, because a lot of these people are misusing a lot of these ideas. They come out of a very specific context, but even so, the way around this, I think, it is an intellectual impasse, like in terms of like, which is it? Does intention matter or doesn't it? The way out of it is to ignore it. Because if convenient, the culture warrior can express a belief that intention doesn't matter while simultaneously attributing responsibility for what you did not intend. If that joke you made on Twitter 10 years ago was intended as a critique of sexism while using sexist language, doesn't matter. You used sexist language. The impact of your words is what matters. You're literally guilty of what you did not intend. At the same time, we see the deployment of the traditional idea of authorship, who the author is and what they've written, applied selectively. It's funny as well because there are a few examples of this that happened in 2020. I mentioned the American Dirt one before, but in 2020, a group of authors signed an open letter in Harper's Magazine decrying cancel culture and sort of like championing open debate. So the letter kind of received a lot of criticism. A common critique focused on who was a signatory rather than what the letter was saying. So several of the authors who signed were considered problematic by some. J.K. Rowling, for instance, who, most people know what she's said publicly. It's been all over the news. There are also people like Thomas Chatterton Williams, who's a Black author who believes in transcending race, which is to say making it less relevant to one's identity. There were also a couple of signatories, in response to this, who removed their names after it was revealed who else had signed it. So clearly, the organizers of the letter, some of its signatories, and many of its critics cared about the concept of authorship in this instance. So there are so many examples whenever like some kind of social media shitstorm happens around things like this, where, suddenly authorship matters. And we saw another example of this when people were trying to justify their interpretation of the Starship Troopers debate earlier. Oh, Paul Verhoeven meant this. This is what he said. Authorship matters. When in another moment, those same people will say that it doesn't matter. that everything's open for interpretation. So I'd say like authors aren't really the end of the story. They're the beginning. The story doesn't really exist with them. Some authors have idiosyncratic styles. Some push language to its limits and they innovate how we express ourselves. Others articulate perfectly something we've been thinking or feeling. Sometimes their biographical details can be relevant for a deeper understanding of what they write. I'm often guilty of this. I love putting biographical details in whenever we talk about a book that I like or an author I like, because it just lends texture to the way that you read a book. It's not something that like limits a book, though. I don't think it is if that's all you're taking out of it is the author's biography. But sometimes biographical details aren't really relevant at all. Most authors, I'd argue, are biographically very uninteresting because they spend a lot of their time writing in front of a desk. So I would say, like, that having a healthy idea of like the author as something that's important to the process of like books and films and stuff like that, it should be there. But like if you're going to be a death of the author's person, you shouldn't be arguing for the author in other contexts, you know? I think this is a practical case for authorship as an important part of the process of culture. And it seems the most true to just be like, sometimes an idiosyncratic style is completely their own. Sometimes biography is important, but sometimes it's not. I don't think it's actually not that complicated. But many of us sort of seem to view the author as a kind of shade drifting between the worlds of the living and the dead, summonable when we need him, banishable when we don't. We don't have to revert to the great men of literature style of interpretation that Barthes was sort of criticizing in his essay. But we can acknowledge that the author actually does matter. Like, it's pretty fucking important. Few writers are truly great or geniuses or symbolic of their age. But nihilistically disavowing authorship as a crucial part of the process of myth making might just be worse. But then what's also worse is hypocritically saying that you disavow the concept of authorship as a matter of course, as a matter of principle, if you're coming from a particular, because usually the death of the author concept is a concept that is used usually by progressive left-wing sort of critics of media and art. So if you're going to do that, you have to be consistent with it, I'm afraid. So don't fall back on this idea of an author if you believe in the death of the author. Because I think you should be open and honest about your nihilistic view. Because if authorship no longer matters, I think you might find very soon that not much of anything matters.
I love Starship Troopers so much. The final moments of the propaganda and film begging you to sign up. They are losing a war they started. The biggest win they can promote in the film is they caught the brain bug and are torturing it. They got nothing.
I will forever love the DVD commentary of Starship Troopers where Verhoeven is talking to viewers like they are children who missed point of the movie. If you see someone in this dressed like a Nazi, that was done on purpose because we are saying these people are bad, bad, bad.
Just like with using Fortunate Son and Born in the USA as patriotic music, yes, we know what was intended, we don't care. Death of the author.
On the semi-annual Starship Troopers discourse, when leftoids say media literacy, what they mean is applying a leftist lens to everything.
The reason it fails on a satirical level is because the emotional disgust the movie lacks turns out to be 100% warranted. If you want to make a movie critiquing fascism, you shouldn't have your collectivism stand in the brainless monsters who only want destruction.
The left believes in the death of the author and the complete deconstruction and reinterpretation of every piece of fiction except Starship Troopers, which can only be understood through the vision of a director that didn't bother to read the source material.
Because that was the original point about the bodying of the author, you were free to jump in and out of the intertextual nature of any work. The dictates of the creator actually put the work of art in a grave-like existence where it could not escape or grow. Derrida and Barthes made that exact point about the tyranny of the author, but as we know that wasn't politically expedient for them.
Even within their own incestuous intellectual traditions, auteur theory has been regarded as suspect since Barthes' The Death of the Author in 1967. Yet they will still argue that the only valid interpretation of Starship Troopers is the one intended by its creators. This oblivious insistence on a very limited set of perspectives being the only legitimate means to understand cultural artifacts.
This crap is one step further beyond the death of the author. It's the suicide of the author. I'm going to make the bad guys all handsome and awesome and relatable while I make the bad guys disgusting brain-sucking bug aliens. But because I said so, it's actually heckin' fascism.
It's weird when you say the Federation in Starship Troopers was aesthetically based off Nazis because the film was intended to satirize fascism and military worship, and people start calling the film pro-American and evoke death of the author to argue with you. I think I tap.
Love how all the people who loved the death of the author and how the meaning of a work is socially constructed when they were taught about it in English 101, and quoted it when Verhoeven adapted Heinlein, are now insisting Starship Troopers is satire because Verhoeven said so.
You shut up. You are the audience. I am the author. I outrank you.